The guilt didn't come from doing something wrong. It came from doing something different, something honest, something outside the role, something that broke a rule no one agreed to out loud, and now the system panics. Because guilt isn't always a moral alarm. Sometimes it's just the cost of finally making a choice that doesn't include self-erasure. This is where most people get guilt wrong. They mistake it for proof that harm was done. They mistake it for evidence they stepped out of line. They mistake it for a sign they need to shrink again. But guilt, in its purest form, is just feedback. It's a nervous system response. It's biological conditioning, wrapped in social programming. It's an emotional signal triggered whenever an established identity is challenged. And for most people, the identity built around constant sacrifice, constant compliance, and constant invisibility is the only identity they know. So, the second a boundary is drawn, guilt rushes in. Not because the boundary was wrong, but because the boundary was unfamiliar. Because choosing differently triggers internal alarms that say, you're breaking the rules, you're letting people down, you're becoming someone we didn't agree on. And because those alarms sound like morality, most people listen. They immediately apologize, they withdraw, they over-explain, they revert back to the old pattern to quiet the noise. But nothing actually gets quieter, because the guilt was never about morality. It was about identity. It was about a deeply wired, survival-level belief that says, to be accepted, you must always put yourself last. To be good, you must always erase your own needs. To be loved, you must always keep your own truth small. Guilt shows up the moment someone breaks those rules, not because they've done something bad, but because they've done something real, and real always disrupts the system, because the system, family systems, social systems, relationship systems, depends on compliance. It depends on people not changing. It depends on predictable roles, predictable reactions, predictable patterns of self-denial. When someone steps out of that role, even gently, even kindly, even subtly, the system experiences it as a threat. And that's when guilt rushes in to manage the threat. It says, don't change the dynamic, don't alter the equilibrium, don't disrupt the peace. But the peace it's protecting was never peace. It was just silent obedience. It was comfort for everyone else at the expense of authenticity. It was calmness for others at the cost of constant self-abandonment. And the body knows this, even if the mind still labels it guilt, shame, or regret. The nervous system knows exactly why guilt appeared, because for the first time, someone chose themselves, and the old identity panicked. That panic doesn't feel like panic. It feels like responsibility. It feels like kindness. It feels like compassion. But it's none of those things. It's conditioning. It's decades of unspoken expectations showing up to enforce an old agreement. You keep everyone else comfortable, and we'll call you good. But good never meant safe. Good never meant respected. Good just meant predictable. And stepping outside that predictability triggers the guilt alarm. Not because anything immoral happened, but because a survival rule was broken. That's why the most meaningful boundaries, the most powerful choices, and the most honest expressions of truth usually trigger guilt first. Because guilt isn't trying to correct behavior. It's trying to protect an identity that was built around self-sacrifice. And until that's clear, guilt will always feel like proof of wrongdoing instead of what it really is. A signal that the person feeling it finally chose something true, something self-honoring, something that breaks the silent contract of compliance. The first step in managing guilt isn't to apologize, it's to wake up. It's to ask clearly and directly, what old rule did I just break? What identity just got challenged? What truth am I finally not betraying? Because when guilt is seen for what it is, conditioning, not morality, it loses its power, not instantly, not entirely, but enough to finally see clearly. The guilt didn't show up because harm was done. It showed up because, for the first time, someone refused to harm themselves. Understanding guilt as conditioning rather than morality is crucial, but awareness alone doesn't rewrite patterns. To truly dismantle guilt, practical action is needed. Not one-time action, consistent, intentional, conscious practice. Step 1. Identify the exact moment guilt appears. Most people experience guilt as a vague discomfort. They feel it, react to it, and move on quickly, usually by apologizing or adjusting behavior. But real clarity comes from slowing down. From pausing at the exact moment guilt surfaces and asking clearly, what just happened? Not emotionally, practically. What boundary was set? What request was made? What truth was spoken? What pattern was interrupted? Because guilt rarely shows up randomly. It appears precisely at the moment an old survival rule is broken. A request was made that felt like asking too much. A boundary was drawn that felt unfamiliar. An honest no was said in a moment that previously would have been an automatic yes. Those moments hold valuable data. They expose the hidden conditioning. I'm guilty because I said no, when the old rule says I always say yes. I'm guilty because I asked clearly for something I used to silently tolerate. I'm guilty because I prioritized myself over someone else's comfort. Identifying the exact cause is the first practical step toward dissolving guilt's power. Step 2. Question the rule underneath the guilt. Once the trigger moment is clear, dig deeper. Ask directly and calmly, who taught me this rule? Why does breaking it feel dangerous? Is this rule still valid or just familiar? Often the answers go back decades to family dynamics, early relationships, old survival strategies. A parent who taught that love required constant sacrifice. A partner who equated compliance with loyalty. A community that rewarded quiet obedience instead of honest expression. These rules weren't written in clarity. They were written in survival. They were formed at times when compliance equaled safety. But now, they're outdated. Step 3. Clearly redefine what guilt means. Most people never update the definition of guilt. They carry childhood interpretations well into adulthood. They continue to treat guilt as a moral compass rather than a nervous system alarm. Rewriting that definition is critical. Instead of guilt meaning, I did something wrong and need to apologize, update it to mean, I just did something different and my nervous system needs time to adjust. That subtle shift changes everything. Now, when guilt arises, it's recognized as adaptation, not accusation. This distinction stops immediate self-blame. It stops reflexive apologies. It creates space for responsible reflection instead of reactive submission. Step 4. Practice tolerating guilt without immediate resolution. This is the hardest step because guilt is uncomfortable. Most people resolve it immediately. They apologize quickly. They revert to old behaviors instantly. They abandon boundaries to restore emotional comfort. But true rewiring demands the opposite. Sit with the guilt. Not forever, just longer than usual. Long enough for the nervous system to learn guilt won't cause collapse. Long enough to realize the discomfort is temporary, not permanent. This step builds emotional resilience. It trains the body not to panic at guilt's first appearance. It teaches the mind that guilt is survivable and often necessary. Step 5. Replace apologies with acknowledgments. This doesn't mean never apologize again. It means reserving apologies for genuine harm, not for self-preservation. Instead, when guilt arises unnecessarily, Practice acknowledgement without self-blame. I feel guilty because I said no, but my no was honest. I feel guilt after setting a boundary, but boundaries are healthy. I feel guilt about making someone uncomfortable, but my comfort matters too. Acknowledging guilt clearly without rushing to fix it rewires internal patterns. It sends a clear message to the nervous system. This discomfort isn't dangerous, it's informative. Step 6. Repeat the practice consistently, even when difficult. Rewiring guilt isn't quick, it's slow, repetitive work. Every boundary drawn, every honest request, every refusal to apologize prematurely builds new neural pathways. Slowly, guilt's automatic reaction weakens. Slowly, the mind adjusts its expectations. Slowly, identity starts aligning around honesty rather than compliance. This doesn't happen in days or weeks. It happens through repetition. Each time guilt is managed consciously, rather than avoided unconsciously, the brain rewrites the rules. Over time, guilt appears less frequently. When it does, it carries less urgency. The nervous system stops equating guilt with survival. It recognizes guilt for what it truly is: feedback, adjustment, growth. And eventually, guilt stops controlling choices. It becomes a gentle reminder that something real just happened. A boundary was respected. A truth was expressed. A self was honored. That's the final practical stage, shifting guilt from something feared into something understood. It never disappears entirely, but it no longer governs behavior. It simply becomes one more signal, a signal that growth is happening, that alignment is deepening, that old roles are finally being shed. That's the true purpose of guilt, not to punish, to wake up. When guilt no longer drives behavior, everything slows down. Not because life becomes easier, but because decision-making becomes quieter. There's less panic, less over-explaining, less scanning the room after every truth spoken. Because now, guilt has been reclassified. It's not the command to back down. It's the flag that something is shifting. And that shift becomes the foundation for something rare, an identity that doesn't run on approval. This is what real integration looks like. Not reacting to guilt, not rushing to repair what was never broken, not folding every time the old discomfort returns, but sitting in it, long enough to feel the difference between doing harm and simply being honest. Because without that difference, growth never stabilizes. People stay stuck in contradiction. They change, but feel bad about it. They speak up, then shrink. They draw boundaries, then apologize for how it made others feel. But once guilt is fully understood, those contradictions dissolve. Now the person isn't just aware of their patterns, they trust themselves inside them. And that trust changes the entire internal landscape. No more needing someone else to validate the choice. No more asking for permission to evolve. No more doubting a boundary just because it made someone uncomfortable. Because now, the compass isn't guilt, it's clarity. Clarity says, this is mine to carry. Clarity says, this isn't my responsibility. Clarity says, I can be misunderstood without betraying myself to fix it. And that kind of clarity isn't loud. It's not performative. It doesn't need to be defended. It just is. That's what the nervous system starts to recognize. Not a new identity built on rebellion, but a stable, grounded self that doesn't need to collapse every time guilt shows up. Because guilt will still show up. The old wiring doesn't disappear. It quiets over time, but it's always in the background, especially in moments of expansion. The difference is, now it doesn't get to lead. It doesn't get to override the choice. It doesn't get to define the meaning of discomfort. It becomes background noise, a faint reminder that the old system is still adjusting. And that adjustment? It's proof of movement. Proof that something real is happening. that boundaries are being enforced, not explained, that values are being lived, not negotiated. That truth is being chosen, even when it's not rewarded. That's the final layer of integration. The ability to carry guilt without collapsing into it. The ability to feel discomfort without reversing growth to make it go away. The ability to live from alignment, even when it's quiet, even when it's lonely, even when it's misunderstood. Because alignment doesn't need applause, it needs consistency. And when that consistency holds, the identity begins to stabilize. Not around guilt, not around compliance, not around false peace, but around honesty. And honesty doesn't erase guilt. It just makes guilt irrelevant to the truth. That's the shift that lasts. Not an absence of discomfort, but a refusal to trade truth for temporary relief. Not because it's easy, but because it's finally real.